Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Rational thinking requires us to sense the reality as a starting point. The verses of the Quran also direct us to study the reality around us as a means to understand the existence of the Creator. This leads us to the idea of contingency. In essence, identifying something as contingent results in us asking the question, why does it exist? Or primarily, what is the cause behind its existence? I think it's important that we get into the discussion and explain what this term contingent really means. But before I go in and explain directly what contingent means, I want to give you some examples. And it's through these examples that we'll better understand what this term is. So imagine while you're watching this video, you see a tennis ball flash across the screen. Yours and my natural reaction is to ask, who and what caused that to occur? What caused this tennis ball to move from one part of the screen to another? Similarly, if I hear a knocking on the door, I'm going to ask the question, who caused the knocking on the door? What is the cause behind that knocking on the door? And so with these two examples, we're noticing certain things. The first thing that we notice is the idea of change. When something changes from one form to another, we ask the question, what brought that change about? The second thing is that these things don't have to be the way they are. So when a ball moves, it doesn't have to move, but it does move. And it might have moved from a position of stationary position to motion. So there is change. And there's not just change, but it changes in a way that it didn't have to. So when we've identified these two characteristics, that there is change and that it didn't have to be that way. When we identify these two things, we inevitably ask, what is the reason for it to do that? Why did it change? Or in essence, what is the cause that has caused this particular state? So a door. The door is not knocking. There is no sound coming from the door. And suddenly I hear tap, tap, tap. And there is a knocking. And I think to myself, that's a change in state. And so as a result, and it's not necessary for the door to make this sound. So I'm going to ask, what's caused that? What's the explanation behind it? Who caused it? Therefore, we say it's in a possible state. Knocking is a possibility of the door. The ball moving is a possibility of the ball. Yeah? The fact that the ball is stationary is a possibility of the ball as well. Let's look at another example. Let's look at the example of a table made out of wood. The wooden table's existence is dependent upon the existence of wood, what it's made out of. I have a wooden table, it's made out of wood. If I had no wood, I would have no table. But let's ask the other question. If I had wood, does it mean I have a table? The answer is no. Why? Why can we say that if I had wood does not necessarily mean I have a table? That's because the wood that makes up the table, it could be in a number of possible states, one of which is a table. So that out of the wood you could make a chair. Out of the wood you could make a wooden bed. Out of the wood maybe spoons. So simply having its material components doesn't necessitate the existence of the particular form, in this case the table. So just because I have the wood does not necessarily mean I have the table, because the wood could exist in a number of different possible states. So and also the other thing about the table is that it could be bigger and smaller than it actually maybe is. So it could be 4 feet wide, or it could be 2 feet wide. So the table is therefore limited, has a particular set of dimensions, has a specific or set of limits. So by identifying the specific set of limits out of a number of possible limits, could be bigger, could be smaller, we would validly ask the question, why is it that size? Why is the wood into a table and not a chair? Does its material components determine obviously a particular size or limitations? No, it doesn't, not necessarily. If I had loads of woods, I could still make a small table and leave the rest of the wood away. Or does it being a table mean it has to be a particular size? No, it doesn't. So we can have numerous potential sizes. So what we're identifying is that a particular wooden table with a particular set of attributes or limits could not have been determined by itself, not by it being table, defining its size and its trait, and not by having wood does it define that it has to be of a certain size and certain attributes and traits. It requires something other than that, the existence of a table, and something other than the existence of the wood in order to determine the existence of a wooden table. Furthermore, another point, the table didn't always have to exist. It had a beginning to its existence and wasn't eternally existent. So it's a possible existence. I could have been non-existent. That's one of its possible states of a thing that begins to exist. Or it could exist. I could come into existence. So contingency, this word, when we come back to it, is identifying that certain things that exist have a possible existence. That's why they use another word for contingency, like a possible being. Here, just as a side point, when we say being, we're not saying being like human being or, living being. Being is that which exists, yeah? And we're saying, therefore, that which exists, which is contingent, is a possible being. It's a possibility. It has a number of possibility. Because it has a number of possibilities, i.e. a contingent possible being, then we ask the question, that the possibility pushes us to ask the question, why is it that possibility as opposed to any other possibility? Let me give you another example, because sometimes these terms and these ideas can be a little bit confusing. A red triangle. So 3 sides are necessary for a triangle. We have to have 3 sides in order to have a triangle. You can't have a 4-sided triangle, or you can't have a round triangle. So 3 sides is necessary for the existence of a triangle. But the fact that it's a red triangle, red is not a necessity for the existence of a triangle. In fact, the triangle could be any color. It could be red, yellow, blue, pink, purple, whatever. Yeah, the rainbow colors. It could be any of these colors. So the fact that the red triangle or the triangle is a particular possibility, particular color, it makes us identify that there is something that has given the possibility or actualized its possibility in that sense. And that thing that actualizes it, causes it to be red as opposed to blue or green or pink, that thing that causes it can't be a triangle, because it's not in the definition of a triangle to be red, and it can't be being red, because red is a attribute of the actual particular triangle. So it's outside of that shape. So what we sense when we talk about contingent or possible things, beings, is we're sensing its dependency upon something else for its existence. So a red triangle, for it to be red, requires somebody to draw a red triangle, yeah, as opposed to a green one. So something has to have caused it. Yeah, this is what we're saying, what we're understanding, what we're sensing, and we're sensing from the possible being a dependency. So in other words, what we're sensing is something dependent. In other words, contingent. And this is when we identify that things didn't always have to exist. So if we can say something is contingent or dependent if things did not always have to exist. Yeah? Like the movement of the ball didn't always exist, and it's necessary, and it's not necessary for the ball to move. That the attributes of a thing, of a being, could be something else. It doesn't have to be that way. So the table could have been bigger or smaller. It's not necessary for the table to be this particular size as opposed to another size. We can say something's contingent, i.e. dependent, if the thing could be potentially arranged in another way. If we identify one or all three of these aspects of a thing, we necessarily ask the question, what caused it? Or who determined it to be that way? I.e., what is it dependent upon? So how does this answer the question, does a creator exist or not? If we identify that things we sense within the universe, and in fact the universe as a whole, is contingent. So that means we're sensing that the universe, or things within the universe, began to exist. That they have attributes. That these attributes could be other than what they are. Yeah? That they could be, that the things within the universe and the universe as a whole could be arranged in another way as opposed to the way that we have come to see it. Then we understand that the universe itself is dependent. I.e., it requires something else to have determined the existence of the universe. And so this can be used, this argument, this point about contingency can be used in a number of ways. So I'll give one of the ways, and maybe a couple of other ways as well. Firstly, let's look at the issue of the wooden table. Yeah. So we say the wooden table is a contingent being, it's not always existed. It required something else for its existence. If we look at it just from a material cause, we can say that the wooden table, for it to exist, required wood to exist. We can say that wood does not exist unless it had, again, it's a contingent being, it requires something else. It hasn't always existed. It's limited, it's finite, it's dependent, has specific attributes, and it requires trees to exist. That's where we get wood, obviously. Trees themselves, they are limited, finite, dependent. They have specific attributes. They require oxygen, they require soil, they require water. They also require sunlight. So they're dependent upon the sun. The sun itself is also a limited being. It has a certain size, has a certain shape, has a certain amount of energy, has certain attributes. And also the sun itself is limited, or is dependent. And it's dependent upon, you know what they say is for the sun to exist, you have to have gas, hydrogen gas, and the hydrogen gas comes together under the force of gravity, and there's a fusion of two atoms. Now some of this maybe sounds a lot of scientific, but the point here is not about the science per se. The point here is about understanding that limited things exist with specific attributes that could be other way, and they began to exist, and therefore, and not only did they begin to exist, but they depended upon something else for its own existence. So we can go back. So we can talk about the fusion of hydrogen atoms that creates heavier elements. This causes the release of energy and heat and light, which causes us to have the sun, which causes us to have sunlight, and this sunlight gives us trees, that gives us wood, that gives us a wooden table. And we can go back further, we can regress further, and we can say, okay, where did this hydrogen, where did this gas exist? And we can talk about nebulas, that they exist. Nebulas are regions in the universe where you have gas and dust, and they come together under the force of gravity. And we can even ask the question, where did nebulas come from? And we can talk about supernovas. These are stars that exploded and therefore released this gas and dust into the universe, which then comes back together to form other stars. And we can ask the question about these supernovas. Where did they come from? What are they dependent upon? They are limited, they are finite, they're dependent, they have specific attributes. What are they dependent? We can start talking about maybe the Big Bang. And again, we can look at the Big Bang. We can say this is a contingent possible reality that exists, that could exist in another way. It didn't have to exist. It's not necessary for us to have a Big Bang and therefore a universe. And we can ask, therefore, what is it dependent upon? And we can talk about, quantum singularities. And we can say, well, what does a quantum singularity depend upon? And we can talk about the, according to one physicist, the collision of membrane structures. And we can say, well, what's the membrane structures dependent upon? They're dependent upon the superstring theory. And we can say, what's the superstring theory dependent upon? And we can say the supercustard theory. Okay, I'm making it up now. But the point that I'm trying to show is that the wooden table, there was a series of interdependent, limited, contingent beings. Each one was dependent upon another thing, that was dependent upon another thing, that was dependent upon another thing, and so on. The question we have with this is that there are, or not the question, but the possibilities that we have with regards to this, is that there are 4 potential possibilities. First one, there is something that is limited but came from absolute nothing. Yeah, so something started everything off. The second possibility is that there is an infinite regression. So one thing depends upon another thing, depends upon another thing, depends upon another thing, forever. Yeah. The third possibility is what we call a cycle. So maybe something depends upon something in this cycle. So, some physicists theorize about this idea of the universe explodes out, expands, gets to a certain size, and then starts to contract and comes together into what they call a big crunch, goes to that quantum level singularity, and then explodes back out again, and therefore the universe is in constant cycle. The fourth possibility is that there must be something that's independent to have initiated this chain, an independent cause or creator. So when we look at these 4 possibilities and we question the first one, could something come from nothing? Well, we've already said that if something is limited, is finite, is dependent, then we are saying that these things are contingent beings. We are valid, not just valid, it becomes necessary for us to ask the question, what caused its existence? So how can a limited, finite, dependent thing have no cause for its existence, just exist? That's the worst form of magic that you can have. When people claim, we don't believe in magic and we don't believe in superstitions, but the biggest superstition that would exist is that limited, finite, dependent things could come from absolute nothing, by nothing, and for no reason whatsoever. It just is not something that's intuitive. It breaks the principles of causality, both the axioms of science and the components within rational thinking. So I think it's important that we discount that. And in the third session, we'll discuss some of these contentions to these arguments in more detail. The second possibility is an infinite regression, so a chain of interdependent things. So the wooden table depends upon wood, trees, sun, nebulas, supernovas, Big Bang, quantum singularity, membrane structures, quantum string theory, or superstring theory, etc., etc. Goes back forever. Could that be a possibility? We'd say no. And the reason why we'd say no is by giving a few simple analogies. But one analogy that comes to mind is to have a row of dominoes. And for the last domino to fall over, it has to be hit by the previous domino. It's an obvious point. You have the last domino, so the second to last domino has to hit it. And for that domino to fall over, it has to be hit by the domino before that. And for that domino to fall over, it has to be hit by the domino before that. Now imagine if you had an infinite regression of dominoes, an infinite chain of dominoes, meaning there's no beginning domino. Would the last domino fall over? In fact, would any of the dominoes fall over? Answer's no. If you think about it, if you have to wait an infinite amount of time for the last domino to be hit, none of the dominoes will fall over. And in fact, at every moment, there is an infinite number of dominoes before it. There's no beginning domino. So an infinite regression is impossible. What does that mean? It means that for us to have a wooden table, we needed to have wood first. For us to have wood first, we needed to have trees. For us to have trees, we needed to have sun. So if there's no sun, there's no trees, there's no wood, there's no wooden table. If that goes back forever, everything that doesn't exist is waiting for the prior form to exist, and that doesn't exist until the prior form to exist, and that goes on forever, nothing exists. nothing can exist in that way. But the fact that we know things exist which are limited, finite, and dependent indicates there must be an initiation start to that that dependent chain, or the cause of the dependent limited things. Now somebody might turn around and say, well, what about a cycle? For example, we have a water cycle. So as an example, in the water cycle, the clouds produce rain, the rain produces water, the water evaporates to produce more clouds, and the clouds produce rain, and there's this cycle of events. So couldn't that be an explanation? Limited things depend upon other limited things, depend upon other limited things in a cycle of in a cyclical cycle or cyclical dependency. Well, if you think about it, and you think about going backwards in the cycle, so you say, okay, before there's rain, what do we need? We need clouds. So if there's no clouds, there's no rain. Okay. So before clouds, what do we need? We need water that evaporates. If there's no water, there's no clouds, there's no rain. But before water, what did we need? We need rain. So we need rain, but there's no rain because there's no clouds because there's no water, there's no rain. So when we go backwards in the cycle, we find that nothing exists. So even if they talk about the Big Bang was dependent upon the Big Crunch and the Big Crunch was dependent upon the Big Bang, there's a popular analogy that springs to mind. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? And you think about this, well, the chicken requires an egg and the egg requires a chicken, or comes into a chicken, and requires a chicken. So you realize actually nothing occurs. So this mutual or cyclical dependency, where limited things depend upon other limited things, does not explain why that cycle exists in the first place. You still need something outside of that cycle. And so something coming from nothing is an irrational approach. An infinite regression is impossible. A cyclical dependency cannot explain the existence of dependent things, as in nothing would exist. They would all be waiting for the previous form to exist in a cycle. So the only possible way to explain the existence of limited dependent contingent things is to refer to an independent, necessary, eternal being, the Creator. So this gives us an understanding that you need to have a necessary eternal being. So what's the difference? Why are we giving an exceptionalism here? Saying, oh, the Creator, we're just saying that He's eternal. No, because we said, why do we ask the question, what caused something? We said, there's change. It doesn't have to be like that. So if we're saying something does not change and it has to be like that, then we wouldn't ask the question, what caused it? We would say, it exists by its own nature. So when we talk about how limited finite dependent things cannot depend upon other limited finite dependent things, whether in a cycle or a chain, then it exists only because an infinite, unlimited, independent, necessary being exists. This is whom we call Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in the next video, we'll also show other implications on the discussion about identifying contingent realities or contingent beings. Thank you.